The president may have left, but the regime remains. In Egypt, the fight for meaningful change is far from over. Has the removal of Mubarak really bent the arc of history? Is it a revolution, an uprising, or is it still too early to define? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. The uprising in Egypt has been described as a revolution by many, including the army. But is it really? Was it a coincidence that Mubarak did not announce that he was stepping down on Thursday last week, as many had expected him to, and then on the following day his vice president told the world that Mubarak had decided to hand over his powers not to the head of the People's Assembly, as stipulated in the constitution, but to the military? Is the military leadership playing an honest transitional role? Is it really trying to meet the demands of those who rose up against the old regime? Or is it in fact working for only limited changes in the country so it can remain in control? Since it took over on February 11th, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, whose head is a longtime Mubarak loyalist, Field Marshal Mohammed Hussein Tantawi, has issued a series of communiques dissolving parliament, suspending the constitution and pledging to hold elections within 6 months. On Tuesday, it convened a committee charged with amending the constitution within 10 days. The amended charter would then be subject to ratification in a referendum in 2 months' time. But the Council has not yet responded to a series of other demands made by opposition forces, broadly called activists for democracy, most notably the immediate lifting of the 30-year-old emergency law, the release of thousands of political prisoners, and the investigation and prosecution of police and security officials responsible for the deaths of at least 300 protesters during the demonstrations that culminated in Mubarak's ouster. Let's discuss this now with our guests. In Cairo, Amr Hamzawi, Director of Research at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. Also in Cairo, Shahir George, a pro-democracy activist who took part in the protests in Tahrir Square. And joining us from Durham in the UK, Anoush Ehtishami, Professor of International Relations at Durham University. Welcome to you all. Amr Hamzawi, the President of Egypt, may have left office, but looking around at the old faces from the previous regime, can one really speak about a genuine revolution?
We can speak about a genuine revolution in terms of what has been happening in Egypt between January 25 and last Friday. However, we have to differentiate between the success of the revolution, which is removing Mubarak, forcing Mubarak to step down, which is the first success of the revolution. What we need and what would be a major success is for us to manage to change democratically Egypt's political system. And this is not only a question of the old faces which are still around, it's a question of the old structures and institutions and mechanisms and processes which are still around. This is what a transitional period is for, and this is why transitional periods, not only in Egypt but elsewhere, are quite complicated and messy.
Is this then a revolutionary movement at best, still trying to fulfill the key demands of the people on the streets? They didn't just want the departure of President Hosni Mubarak, they wanted the dismantling of the existing system.
And not only the dismantling of the existing system, we would like to build a new democratic system. It's not only about dismantling the old, which continues to exist, but it's about building a democracy, a democratic polity as well. We have so far achieved only the first goal, which is to force Mubarak to step down. However, in terms, as I said, we are still facing structural limitations, institutional limitations, authoritarian and autocratic games which are being played around us, and they all belong to the old system which continues to exist. And the new, which is being rebuilt as of now, or where we are trying to rebuild it as of now, is quite difficult to give birth to. We are seeing a military establishment which is managing, albeit in the right direction, everything on its own. We are still missing an institutionalization of a national dialogue. We do not have a real non-governmental contribution to what's going on, and we are still having difficulties understanding what is really the timeline we are looking at for the transitional period. So these are all questions which are going to be with us for some time, at least for the next six months to 1 year.
Shahir George, how troubling are these lingering questions to you? You were one of the people who took to the streets of Cairo demanding that the old system be brought down, that the established order be done with. Do you feel that the revolution has lived up to the ideals that you expressed? After all, the system that people wanted to uproot is still very much in place. So are the same people who were appointed by President Mubarak, they still hold the key positions of government to this day.
I think the concern is not only the key people who are still holding positions in government, but as Dr. Am was saying, it's the transitional period. Are we still, are the army is moving in the right direction in making clear amendments of the constitutions, or even stopping working with the current constitution and building a new constitution that ensures a real democratic system, that ensures clear separation of powers, right for political parties to act, to remove the emergency law, and to create a real democratic environment. That's what we are still missing at the time being, and that's what's still being alarming. And also, the fact is that the army is still monopolizing power and not integrating or including other forces to be part of the decision-making of how the transitional period should move forward is also alarming. And definitely part of it is the fact that there are still some of the old regime members that are still in the current government is also alarming and needs to be tackled. These people need to be removed. Even the prime minister, I think he's still a representative of the old regime, and many people on the ground, and many demonstrators are not happy to have the same government that President Mubarak assigned to still stay in power.
Professor Anoush Ehtishami, can the army then be the source of this revolutionary change when for so many years, for decades, the army in fact represented the backbone of this regime, had entrenched economic interests? Some estimates put the level of economic interest the army had in its control to about 40% of the economy. So therefore, will it bring about the change that is needed, or would it simply protect the current status quo?
I think the armed forces will play the role of a midwife in the process that is now unfolding in Egypt. I mean, certainly, as you say, it has got very deep vested interests in the continuation of the current structures. But at the same time, it has very clear mandate in terms of national defense and pursuit of national interest. And the national interest is now being articulated by the brave men and women of Egypt, and not by a security-ridden, driven, small elite. And that contrast is something that the armed forces have of necessity take into account when they begin to change the dynamics of power in Egypt. And the dynamics of power are changing, and they will continue to change. What we are really talking about is the pace of that change and how deep it will be. Those are questions that we can debate, but certainly I cannot see this process coming to an abrupt halt on the basis of what army's interests or financial vested interests might be or indeed are.
Amr Hamzawi, in order to make a complete break with the old system and to put Egypt on a more solid path toward democracy, should the constitution have simply been thrown into the dustbin of history instead of being tweaked here and there? And should a constituent assembly have been elected with the sole purpose of rewriting this constitution instead of making amendments to it in a conclave?
Yes, of course, and it's what we have been calling for, what we have been pushing for, and here the we refers to a group of Egyptian intellectuals, writers, politicians, as well as the different protest movements. Shahir has been part of it, I have been part of it, the different protest movements on the ground. All of us have called for not only amending the constitution, because we have the constitution of 1971 is a presidential constitution which really concentrates powers and prerogatives in the hands of the president and has the capacity of making a dictator of each Egyptian president, unless amended substantially, which would mean that we will have to amend much more than the 6 articles currently being discussed, or much better would be to write a new constitution which would take Egypt in the direction of a parliamentary democracy and not a presidential democracy. However, and this is where you really have to look at what kind of sort of contradictory processes are taking place in a transitional period, because as I said, they are messy and complicated. We have time limits as well, and I guess one of the driving forces for the armed forces in specifying 6 months as the duration of the transitional period is to get over it quickly and hand power to an elected civilian government, because they would like to leave. Of course, they will sustain some cards in the political game, but they would like to leave. So here we had a contradiction between drafting a constitution, electing a constitutional assembly, which would have taken a longer time, and assigning a committee to look at constitutional amendments and at least conduct the presidential and parliamentary elections based on them. And maybe later, when we have an elected parliament, not a rigged parliament, we can ask the parliament to look into drafting a new constitution.
Well, it would take a longer time. It would take a longer time. Of course, it's a more cumbersome process. But don't you think it would also have more representation and more legitimacy in the eyes of Egypt's population if there were indeed an election of a constituent assembly?
Of course, but once again, we are facing time limits which everyone has to realize. I'm not defending the choice of the army. As I said, I mean, I pushed in a different direction. However, I realize where they are coming from, and I'm looking at the transitional period as transitional period A and transitional period B. So if we manage to get the transition period A right with electing a president and an elected parliament based on amendments, substantial amendments to 7+ articles of the Constitution,
okay, well,
that would be fine for the transition period A. And then we'll have to move to B, and here's a discussion on the parliamentary system, and the new Constitution will come up again.
You mentioned the time frames involved in this. Shahir George, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, is talking about having the new Constitution being in a state of readiness in about 10 days and then being put to a referendum in about 2 months. Do you think that 10 days to put together a constitution is enough time to allow for a broad discussion of this that would bring in not just members of the opposition, but the public in general?
I think maybe 10 days is enough, because it all depends on the committee members, because I think the amendments and issue of amending the Constitution have been discussed over and over again, and I think most experts in the committee already have clear ideas of what needs to be amendment. The problem is not the time limit, but the problem is what will be receiving after 10 days. If it will only stick to the 6 articles that they have been mentioning without any reference, even if we accept that the Constitution of 71 will stay in power, we cannot accept the powers of the president to stay the same. We cannot accept the judiciary branch to be dependent on the executive branch. We need to have more guarantees if they consider the Constitution. So I think 10 days might not be enough to ensure that all articles of the Constitution, but also I'm sure if there are willingness with the committee members to address all committees, they will be ready with drafts to be presented in 10 days. So the more importance is what kind of amendments this committee members are willing to show us, and I think it has to be massive. And that's why working with the current Constitution is kind of ridiculous, because even if they are willing to amend this current Constitution, they will have to go through so many articles that we should be expecting. Otherwise, no clear democratic transition. We do not want to have free and fair elections and then a president with absolute power, even if it's elected, comes to power again. We do not want this. This is not enough guarantee for a real democratic reform.
Professor Anoush Ehteshami, how do you assess the moves taken so far by the military? The fact that they did not immediately announce some kind of a transitional government, a presidential council that would include members of civil society, members of the judicial system, members of the military as well, would that have been essential to put Egypt on a more solid path toward democracy?
I think the Military Council is aware of all of these constraints on its activities, and is also fully aware of the pressure points which are already in evidence in Egyptian society. What it seems to me it is doing is pacing itself in such a manner as to ensure that what it puts in place is solid. It may not be fast enough, it may not be as far-reaching as Shahir wants, for example, but nevertheless, these are incremental changes, as Dr. Ahmed said, which we are beginning to experience. And the range of options on the table are things that, frankly, the military officers are frankly not trained to take account of. This is not their day job. This is not the way that they've trained to interact with the state and government and society. And therefore, I welcome the fact they are being slow and measured, providing, of course, that they are consulting a wider community, and for all that we know that they are, and that they are aware of the importance of an independent judiciary, that goes without question. And also the need to make sure that we move towards a parliamentary democracy and change the balance of power also between the Prime Minister and the President. But these are all things which are already being talked about in Egypt very openly, and indeed were subject of discussions during the Mubarak era about what would happen when Mubarak eventually goes. And so it's not surprising that things are not going to everybody's satisfaction.
Well, for now, Egypt is ruled by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces under the leadership of Field Marshal Mohammed Hussein Tantawi. A U.S. diplomatic cable that was released recently by WikiLeaks, dating to March 2008, described the 76-year-old Tantawi as, quote, charming and courtly, but also aged and change-resistant. The cable adds that he and Mubarak are focused on regime stability and maintaining the status quo through the end of their time. Amr Hamzawi, the cable also goes on to say that Field Marshal Tantawi is viewed by the mid-level ranks of military officers in Egypt as Mubarak's poodle. How much confidence does he inspire in the people to be the de facto head of state that he is today?
Well, I mean, I'm really not for personality-based discussions. This is exactly what we do not need as of now in Egypt. We need to focus on procedures and institutions, and we need to focus on measures and processes. So taking what the military council has been doing, I do not see a trajectory. I mean, I'm not saying that what they are doing is leading to lack of confidence among Egyptians, but I do not see a clear trajectory. I do not see the broad dialogue which they should be doing, consulting with representatives not only of political forces but of the protest movements on the ground which made the revolution, or at least inspired the revolution in the first days. I am not seeing that, so I am not seeing a trajectory which would ensure me to say, well, they are going to leave Egypt, leaves the political scene in Egypt in 6 months after establishing at least the beginnings of a functioning democracy. There are many questions which they do not raise as of now, and they need to be raised. Once again, I am not aware of any country which managed a successful transitional period to democracy per military decrees. I mean, this needs to be changed. It is fundamentally anti-democratic. They have to get an institutionalization of the national dialogue and at least to listen in a measured manner, but in a systematic manner to what other people are saying on the ground in Egypt. They have to let us know what they are going to do with the constitution, as you've raised. And it's, by the way, it's not only 6 articles. We have 6 articles which will be amended and 1 which will be removed. The so-called terrorism law, Article 179, which will be removed. So it's a total of 7 articles and related laws. And the letter which established the commission gives its members the authority to look at other articles as well. And here, as Shahir mentioned, we really know what needs to be done in terms of at least pushing us to democratic elections, parliamentary and presidential. But ultimately, they will have to let us know what they are willing to do with regard to the constitution, which is extremely presidential and focuses authorities in the hands of the president. And then what are they going to do with the current cabinet, which is still an NDP cabinet, hated figures, hated from Egyptians, not respected in the public opinion, and extremely corrupt figures still around. What are they going to do with it? And finally, where is civil society and where are trade unions and professional associations? All of them have to be taken into consideration and included in a process. What I'm missing is a clear participatory model for managing the transitional period. And therefore, I do not see a trajectory, in spite of my respect to what the Army and the Supreme Council has been doing so far.
Well, thanks very much. Many questions raised there that we will be able to discuss with our 2 other guests, Shahir George and Professor Anoush Ihtishami. But for now, thank you very much, Amr Hamzawi. I know you have to leave our discussion at this point. Thank you so much for being with us. So, Shahir George, let me put to you some of the points that were raised there by Amr Hamzawi, the fact that he does not see a clear trajectory. How much of it still lies in the hands of people like you, people who brought about this change, this momentum on the streets of Egypt? Will you be keeping up the pressure on the military rulers now to make sure that they fulfill all of the demands that you had? Will you be taking back to the streets until all of these demands are fulfilled?
Definitely. I think our only guarantee to ensure democratic reform and what pushed the military to step in and Mubarak to step down is the street. And I think that's why demonstrators will still be staying in the streets, and on Friday there are a coalition of youth who are intending to do a demonstration. It's a celebration, but also it's a reminder of the army that we still have a clear demands for democratic transition that we are not seeing. We might be seeing some good steps, but also there are some setbacks. And also, I have to say, it's not an issue of trusting military intentions. We do not want to question intentions, but the issue is that we don't think the military as an institution that was only responsible for defense will have all the knowledge to know how to lead a democratic transition. That's why we were more keen at first to have a presidential council where the military could have been part of, but also you were willing for 2 other civilians to be part of this presidential council, who might be able to have both views of civilians and military at this stage. But at the end of the day, our clear guarantee is the street. This is what brought us reform in the first place, and I think this will survive and guarantee more democratic reform and ensuring our revolution is not going in vain. And I don't think the revolution is over. We still see this process as part of the revolution, and we still see the street as a key player that we want to remind any political force who's taking charge of the country that the people in Egypt this is a revolution for democracy, and we won't accept no less than a clear and strong democratic transition. We will not accept
even if it means coming up
reforms.
against the army, and we saw the clear affinity that people in Egypt have for the army. In the case of Iran, for example, when the Shah of Iran went into exile, the protests continued until the complete dismantling of the system.
I don't think we're in the position to say that we're against the army. The army, in most of their statements, they say that they will respond to people's demands. It's just simply a reminder of these demands. It's not that we want to confront the army, and so far we see that the army is giving signals that they want to protect what the revolution had said in first place, and we just want to remind them with this if they think that the people on the streets are satisfied. It's just a small reminder, it's a quick reminder of our demands in case the army is not aware. And we want to show that this is not simply a representation of a few people who negotiate, but it's a real demand in the street. And I think the army will be more open for us to do our demonstrations. And so far they haven't shown any indicator of closing out on demonstrations, especially when it's peaceful. And we will never use violence or confrontation. We're always demanding for peaceful demonstration that represents our opinion, and that's our legitimate right that I think the army will protect rather than dismantle.
Professor Anoush Ihtishami, how important is it in assessing the military's intentions going forward to look back at the way the military took power just a few days ago? We were told by Omar Suleiman that President Mubarak had decided to transfer his powers to the military in flagrant violation of the Constitution. Article 84 of the Constitution does not foresee that kind of transfer of power in case of resignation of the president. In fact, if the president had resigned, and we did not hear him say this specifically, 24 hours earlier he was saying he was staying on until the end of his term, his powers should have been transferred, according to the Constitution, to the Speaker of Parliament. That did not happen. What are we to make of this? Was it a silent coup, perhaps, that came on the heels of what was a revolutionary uprising? Can a coup be discounted?
I wouldn't see this as a coup d'etat because, frankly, we're not seeing the fierce side of the armed forces. As far as one can gather, they have not fired a single shot in anger throughout this process, and indeed have ensured that their weapons are not pointing in the direction of the people. So the coup d'etats that we've seen in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America, and indeed in the Arab world itself, have taken a much more bloody, violent format. And we've known from the very beginning when the military steps in, as it has done in Turkey, for example, in recent past, and Pakistan and elsewhere. This doesn't smell.
But a coup does not always have to be bloody, does it? A coup d'etat does not always have to be bloody, but clearly they took power in violation of the Constitution.
No, it's true, but but the Constitution is all for grabs. I mean, if I may say, the Vice President was only in his job for a week after 30 years of a vacancy. The Prime Minister has had no credibility. The Speaker of Parliament, given that this is a single-party parliament, has no credibility. In a sense, none of those guys were legitimate in the eyes of the Egyptian people, rightly so, to take charge of a post-Mubarak era. We are and we were in an extraordinary situation, and the armed forces has stepped in. It seems to be with the blessing so far of the people to return stability and security to the streets, but also, as I said at the beginning, to midwife a transition to democracy. The army is not going to make the transition to democracy. It is the political forces which will do that, and at the same time, the same political forces actually redefining the role of the security establishment broadly, within which, of course, the armed forces have now emerged as a dominant factor. In that environment, there was hardly any other force that could have been mobilized. I remind all of us that the fear in the streets of Washington was of a Muslim Brotherhood takeover in the absence of Mubarak. Well, we haven't seen that happen either.
Professor Anoush Ihtishami in Durham and Shahir George in Cairo, thank you both very much indeed for joining us for this discussion on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you very much for joining us. We welcome your comments. As always, do send them to us by email to insidestory@aljazeera.net. From all of us for now, thanks for watching.